Yeah, hello and welcome to our channel. Today I have an interesting guest. His name is Jonathan. Jonathan, you are working for OPIS and for other institutions that care for the prevention of suffering. Jonathan, my first question to you, can you please introduce yourself and introduce what you're doing?
Okay, so my name's Jonathan Leighton. I perhaps most importantly, I run a Swiss nonprofit think and do tank called OPIS, which is short for the Organization for the Prevention of Intense Suffering. And just to give you a little bit more of a sense of my background, I'm originally from Canada. I've lived most of my adult life in Europe, and I have a scientific background. I actually did a PhD in Basel, Switzerland, and basically over the years, I moved more away from trying to solve microscopic problems and I became more interested in the big questions like what matters and what can we do about it. And that led me to write two books. My last book came out early in 2023, called The Tango of Ethics. And my first book came out in 2011. That was The Battle for Compassion. Both books are about trying to understand why is there suffering in the world, why is there so much suffering in the world, and what can we do about it, and how can we think about it in a structured, ethical way. And in between those books is when I founded Opus in 2016. So that's sort of a short background. I don't hear you, Jens.
Yeah, very nice to hear. Thanks for this introduction. So, when I have read from your organization Opus, I was very happy to see that there exist people who care for such topics because it's not a mainstream topic. Nevertheless, if you start to inform yourself, you see there is quite a big range of people around the world who care for the topic of the prevention of intense suffering.
Hmm.
Um, Brian Tomasic is a name, a guy living in the USA, for example. Um, my next question to you would be, how did you personally come to the topic to prevent intense suffering? What is the reason? What would you say? What is the reason why it should be a main topic of, yeah, our whole world, if you want to be like that,
Yeah,
um, to prevent suffering?
yeah. I guess maybe first of all, I would say that there are a lot of people in the world that do care about suffering, and they may not talk as explicitly about suffering, but many of the cause areas and the charities they do focus on very specific areas of suffering. So I think it's not as rare as all that. Um, I initially got into science partly because I wanted to help to discover a cure for cancer and help people in that way and somehow address suffering. Um, it's hard to pinpoint one specific reason why I became drawn to the topic of suffering. I think it's partly a matter of just my own character and also exposure to some of the things that happened, obviously during World War II and the Holocaust, which affected my family directly. So I saw a lot of very hard footage when I was in school
Mhm.
that really sensitized me to that. And then also, I remember during the war in Bosnia, I would see pictures on TV of people really in misery because of the conflict. Um, so I think I was especially drawn to the topic of human caused suffering in humans, largely due to conflict. And I think with time, my interest expanded really to consider all suffering, including animal suffering, which was not really my first motivator. And as I became more aware of what animals experience, especially at human hands, I realized that, it's really the phenomenon of suffering that matters. This is actually one of the key themes of my work and in my first book, that suffering is an internal phenomenon. It doesn't matter who experiences it. If the intensity is high, it matters just as much. Um, yeah, and obviously there's just so much suffering in the world, and a lot of it is hidden from view. We're not aware of it. I mean, that's obviously the case with a lot of animal suffering because animals are kept on factory farms and People don't see them suffering unless they watch videos, which are very difficult to watch. But I think even a lot of ordinary people suffer in ways that we're not aware of. There's a lot of depression, a lot of mental illness. People struggle a lot, and a lot of it is, I mean, we can go more into the causes, but a lot of it is just because of a lot of it is preventable and could be prevented through better policies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see it the same way. Before starting to talk about animal welfare, I want to talk about the things that you are doing for the prevention of human suffering. For example, there's the topic cluster headache on the
Mhm.
website. Maybe you can talk something a bit about what is cluster headache, but
Yeah,
also you can, or I'm also very interested in the topic, what else when it comes to human suffering are you and your organization doing?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the two main cause areas that we've been most active in over the past few years have been access to pain relief. The first one was access to morphine, because so many people in the world live in countries where they can't get morphine if they're in severe pain, especially people with terminal cancer. But then we discovered that cluster headaches are an excruciatingly painful condition that is, it's uncommon, but it's not that rare. It has about the same prevalence as multiple sclerosis, which everyone is aware of. You can read descriptions of it. It's just awful. I mean, people describe it as the worst pain you can imagine. And the medical options are not very satisfactory because they don't reliably prevent attacks. But it was discovered initially by a guy in Scotland that certain psychedelics are very effective in preventing attacks. This guy in Scotland, who I met actually at a conference last year, he discovered that he was getting cluster headaches, and the 1 year where he didn't get them, the only thing that was different was that he had taken some LSD. Within the cluster headache community, this has become quite well known that magic mushrooms that contain psilocybin or LSD can often be very effective in preventing attacks when nothing else works. The problem is that these substances are illegal in most countries. And so what we've been doing is advocacy to try to promote first of all, to increase awareness of what cluster headaches are and to show how bad they are by documenting what patients say about them, and then also documenting the efficacy of these substances. So I mentioned psilocybin and LSD, which are particularly good as preventatives, but then there's something else called DMT, which is in the same chemical family, the smaller molecule, and it's actually the psychoactive component of ayahuasca, which many people are familiar with. DMT can be inhaled and abort attacks literally within seconds. And again, it's illegal. So, people can sometimes access it, through their networks. But really, these are substances that should be legally available, ideally by prescription by doctors. But nobody should ever have to risk going to jail because they're taking something that will relieve their pain. So this is something we've been focusing on just because, the suffering is so extreme, and there are actually substances that work really effectively. And we're just trying to sensitize people, especially doctors and politicians. We had one small success, for example, in Canada, where the government, Health Canada, the health ministry, actually gave permission for a cluster headache patient to use psilocybin, but it was just a one-off. So it was under a special access program. So it's sort of like a foot in the door, but it doesn't mean that everybody can now use it legally. And we're hoping that by continuing to raise awareness also with other organizations, that things will continue to shift, especially as more evidence is gathered.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Yeah, you were also already talking about the fact that there was many psychological illness, mental health issues also in Western world, and it's not seen. What would you say? What can be done to improve this topic? My
Yeah.
opinion is that many people that have psychological issues, they do not go to doctor or very late, and they prefer suffering instead of
Yeah.
going to the doctor and give medicaments.
Okay. So I have to admit, first of all, this is getting a little bit beyond my sort of core expertise. It's not something I've engaged with quite as much. Although we are working on a guide to compassionate governance, which will provide very specific policy proposals to address different sources of suffering. I can just give you my impression that a lot of the mental health issues that people suffer from are, at least in part, due to the system that we live in, which can be very uncompassionate towards people that let's say have difficulty earning a living. There's lots of other societal reasons people are not living as close together with families, and there's a lot more isolation. One other thing which I've become more aware of is the extent of child abuse and also bullying in school. And I think these have profound effects on people's well-being, even well into adulthood. We're carrying out a survey right now to get a better sense of the intensity of suffering due to different conditions. And I was struck by the number of people that have suffered from child abuse or were bullied in school, and the suffering that they've mentioned has been caused by that. It's really widespread, and it's not addressed properly because schools, for the most part, I think, are not very good at addressing bullying. And there's so much abuse that goes on at homes, and we need things like education of both children and adults. Children to know that they can be helped, that there are people there who can help them if they're suffering from abuse at home, but also adults to learn that rather than take out their frustrations and anger on children, that they can also go to therapy and get support. This requires a real shift in attitudes at the societal level. These obviously are not all the causes of mental health issues. Once somebody has mental health issues, they need to there need to be support systems in place that are easily accessible and affordable or provided by the state. I think a lot of it really, having strong connections and friendships is probably one of the biggest let's say impediments to falling into a mental health trap. But obviously a lot of people need professional therapy, and that's just something which needs to be made available at an affordable cost.
Yeah, I have a lot of ideas on this topic because isolation is a topic always more and more people especially Western societies, live alone when they are aged, don't have anybody more. Family is becoming less people are living in good families. In Germany, the sociologists already have the word Singelisierung der Gesellschaft, what could be translated into singleization of society. More people become single, so do not live together in a partnership, etc. And this makes the feeling of loneliness more and more common.
Maybe I could just add, I think there are innovative solutions that are possible that would not be very complicated either. Just providing places where, let's say, where elderly people can meet from time to time, or creating networks that they can meet new people, almost like I don't know exactly what format would be most appropriate, but I know these things like that have been tried, or to have have a system where elderly people are visited regularly. It can make a huge difference, I would imagine, to people's mental health. So I think a lot of it is just a matter of recognizing the problem and finding innovative solutions. It's not, it shouldn't be that difficult, but I think a lot of elderly people are sort of just forgotten about, and maybe they don't have maybe a very strong lobbying voice to have their needs taken into account.
Maybe as a hint for your work, I can tell you, at least in my city, but I guess in many German, maybe European cities, there do exist a lot of projects for elder people, also for young people. but it's not so known by the people in our city, I can say. If you inform yourself in internet and brochures, you can read there is this thing, there is a coffee for elder people, there is a coffee for young people, there is a game event, and it's all for free without cost. It's organized by the city hall.
Hmm.
Many people do not know because they do not watch into internet, they do not have the access to this. So I guess it's, in my opinion, it's not so much a topic that the offers do not exist, but to share the offers wider. That's maybe the topic we need to improve.
Yeah. And I'm sure it depends on the country. Maybe these are offers that exist in some places and are very rare in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
So there's yeah, obviously a need to share successes in some places so that these become more widespread.
Mm-hmm. You were talking about bullying in schools. I think it's a big topic. I guess it has been a little bit better compared to the time when we two have been in school, but still, I have the feeling teacher prefer to look away. It's too difficult for them to look after every pupil. Um, the second topic is violence in general, and especially
Mhm.
wars. And now we are living in a world where again war is coming more and more often when we think on Ukraine, on Israel and Palestine, on Sudan. And you were writing a very interesting paper about a solution of the Israel-Palestinian conflict where you have the idea
Mm.
of more empathy. Can
Yeah,
we talk about that?
yeah. I mean, it sounds it can sound very utopian to talk about, oh, I found the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. But I think what I do definitely think is that there's a need for a whole different way of looking at things, almost like a paradigm shift. Um, Ultimately, we want to get to the point where people on both sides of, or all sides of the conflict are encouraged to allow themselves to imagine what it's like for somebody on the other side. Um, and just in general, not even with the protagonists of a conflict, but even outside, for people to get away from a blaming mindset where we say, okay, this is really all the fault of this side and they should be punished, but to try to find pragmatic solutions that are based on human nature. Now, it's very difficult when the emotions are so inflamed and people are so, angry is not even a word. It's people are just they demonize the other side. And from an outside perspective, we might look at what's happening in Israel and Palestine and say that what Israel has done in Gaza is just absolutely out of proportion, and we can say they're committing war crimes. We're going to use other words, um, and that may well be true. And at the same time, if you want a peaceful solution, you need people on both sides agreeing to it, and that means that at some level you need to address the needs of both sides. Um, even if one side from the outside seems like they're, the bad guys, um, people don't see themselves like that. They see themselves as people experience fear, they see threats, and it shuts off their capacity for empathy. And when that happens, then all kinds of horrible things can happen. And we've seen this on both sides in the conflict. Um, it's there's obviously no easy solution because just from the Israeli side, there's a lot of trauma in the population. Obviously, generational trauma, and this very strong conviction, this feeling of victimhood from the past, and this refusal to, I would I would say, this very sort of strict kind of mindset that says, we're not going to allow ourselves to become victims again. Um, and somehow you almost need to address the trauma at a large scale. And I'm not sure exactly how that's possible, or if things can sort of shift over time. Um, Fortunately, there are many people on both the Israeli and Palestinian side who renounce violence and don't seek revenge, even people who are directly affected, whose families were killed. It's still a relatively small minority, but I think the potential for empathy and for getting out of this blaming, vengeful mindset is really the key. Because there are solutions that are being proposed that are very not, I would say utopian, but not in the sense of being impossible, but solutions that would really go a long way to addressing needs on both sides. For example, two-state, not just a two-state solution, but a two-state confederation where there would eventually be some degree of freedom of movement, where people's basic needs for respect would be recognized. There are very concrete solutions on the table. But the challenge is to try to shift mentalities and to try to grow a mindset, let's say, that understands that this is what people do in these situations. You put anyone into the same situation, you have them grow up in a certain environment, and that is how some people will act. So, and this is really a key to my whole sort of perspective on many problems, is that blaming is very human and natural, but it's not a solution. We've got problems that we need to solve, and the solutions come from listening to people's needs and trying to address those needs. And I think this is absolutely key. It's just very hard to do when you're in a sort of an angry, vengeful mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is an organization called the Parental Circle, and it's parents in Israel who have lost their child, and parents in Palestine who have lost a child, and they work together for peace. And that's an amazing organization. Mia had the idea that you should put Israeli children and Palestine children together in the kindergarten so that they grow up together. And when you come talking to needs, it's very interesting. There is a sociologist called Sven Fuchs, who has, not only him, there is many who have the theory, also Lloyd Demouse, that childhood experiences affect how adults think. So if children grow up, if in a society, the majority of the children grows up with violence, parental violence, then they are anti-democratic as adults, more, they have more authoritarian thoughts, they have more violent thoughts. So and then he's checking that in all countries where is war, there is much violence against children. Russia is a very, very violent country. Palestine, many Palestinian parents beat their children. Also in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox, also violence against children is there quite normal. So a solution could be to go to the parents, to make them educate their children with love, and then automatically these adults will be more peaceful people. Maybe that's an idea what you can do, but I think
it's a long-term approach, but I don't think not too many people, let's say, are realistically expecting the conflict to be resolved within a few years. And it would be great if it could, but I think it's very important to sort of plant the seeds so that at least in a generation's time, there will be more people who will be open to these to peaceful solutions. Because I think it's really important to think in terms of scaling up. I think part of the problem is that it can feel very good when people on both sides meet and share, but if it's only done on a small scale, it won't have that much impact on the politics. So somehow there needs to be an attempt to institute larger programs that cover a much larger percentage of the population.
Mm-hmm. Before coming to talking about animal abuse and animal welfare, let's talk about compassionate governance. How could it be working? I have heard the idea of effective altruism. What's very interesting.
Yeah.
If you donate, you can check which organizations have the most impact? Where is my 10 euros has the most impact? What do you think
Yeah.
about it?
So I've been connected with the effective altruism movement for, over 10 years after my first book came out. And what I think is great about effective altruism is that there's really an attempt to do the most with the resources available, especially in areas where it's actually possible to, to compare the impact of interventions. And this can work, for example, for saving lives. What's the best way to save a life, or what's the cheapest way of saving life? These are the classical interventions to prevent children from dying of malaria. Um, or there's the focus on, let's say, animal welfare, and how can we prevent as many animals as possible from being used by humans. I would say, in general, one of the maybe blind spots of the movement is suffering, especially human suffering. So there's a concern for human lives, there's a concern for animal suffering, but human suffering somehow seems to be left out. There aren't that many charities that are focused on that. And the other difficulty is that a related difficulty is that there aren't really well-established metrics for looking at suffering. There are metrics like, well, just the cost of saving a life. There are the health metrics like the QALYs and the DALYs, which are based on, adjusted life years, which can be affected by a disability. But there's nothing that really looks at the core phenomenon of suffering. That's starting to change. And, in my last book, I also proposed a couple of suffering metrics. Perhaps most importantly, days lived with extreme suffering. So we're not trying to pull together different intensities of suffering, but saying let's partly look at the individuals, whether humans or animals, that are experiencing suffering at the level of 9 or 10 out of 10. So I think these metrics need to be taken into account in looking at the impact of different charities or programs. So yeah, I mean, to basically sum up that part, I mean, I'm a believer in the mission of effective altruism, but especially among, let's say, the subset of EA that is particularly focused on suffering. Because there are other causes that have less to do with suffering and more about, realizing the potential of humanity, and, which are things that are nice to have, but I think that suffering is the top priority.
Yes.
I don't know if that answers your whole question. You're talking about compassionate governance as well. I think this is actually, I mean, this is in a way a separate question, but I would say that this is not an area that tends to be covered that much either by the effective altruism movement. Did you have a specific question about compassionate governance, or do you want to expand on that?
I think it's enough. Maybe you can tell us if we are now, me and the watchers of the video, are interested in doing something for compassionate governance. What can everybody do on his own to improve?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I mean, it's sort of the question that anyone asks. I want to make a difference in the world, and what can I do? I guess there are a couple of guidelines. One is just from a personal perspective to try to be the change that you want to see in the world. So to actually carry out a lifestyle that is sort of a model for how you would like other people to live. And I think one thing that people can do just on a very personal level is to try to reduce or even eliminate the animal products in their diet, because there's so many things that are difficult to change. The one thing that we have the most control over is what we eat. So, it's very hard to change systems of government, to change policy, can require years of effort. But the one thing that you can decide on is what you decide to put on your plate. And because there's so much suffering associated with animal farming, especially on factory farms, that's right away something that people can do. And that's in alignment with the idea of being the change you want to see in the world, because nobody wants to see factory farms. Beyond that, it's a matter of supporting causes and movements that are trying to change things. So, this is something that OPIS is trying to do now. As I mentioned, we were working more on pain relief, but that was partly opportunistic because we saw some cause areas that were important and had obvious solutions. But our goal from the beginning has been to aim at a sort of a higher level, and try to promote the core ethics, the ethic of preventing suffering. And so to promote the ethics in various governmental decision-making mechanisms, and then to show what are the policy implications of these ethics. So for somebody, who wants to have as much impact as possible, so sure, they can go the effective altruism route and look for charities that are having specific impact in specific areas. Or they can say, okay, what we really need is systemic change, and look for organizations like OPIS, for example, that are trying to promote trying to nudge towards a more compassionate system, based on some core values, which we will be addressing in our guide, which is coming out in the first half of 2025. And it's a lot about institutionalizing listening to needs, which is a solution to that, I would say just about everything, including conflict resolution, finding ways of building trust, depolarization, and then some other ideas that come from the study of complex systems and how we can hope to move towards a system that is generally more compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, anyone who's interested, I would encourage them to go on the OPIS website, and there'll be more information there about this particular topic in the future when our guide comes out. But people can also get in touch with me if they'd like to, just get into contact. And if people are interested in supporting our work, that's very much welcome.
Yes, very nice. You must be the change you wish to see in the world, Mahatma Gandhi's citation.
Yeah.
And it's a good finish point for the first part of our talk. Compassionate food is vegan food. We will talk in the second part of our talk about animal welfare. So at first, dear watchers, don't forget to like the video, to share it, and maybe to write a comment with your ideas. And we see you again in the second part. Bye-bye.